Welcome. Today, we will be discussing the health technologies that we think are hot and will be influential in 2023. Hello. Hi, Gandhi. How are you doing today?
Not too bad, mate. Yourself?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. Yeah. So, excited to do our annual look at hot health technologies coming up and that we think will be influential in the coming year. So, looking forward.
Definitely. Like you say, we've reviewed the hype cycle on an annual basis. And I guess sometimes we've got it right, sometimes we've got it wrong. I think it'd be useful to have a look at what is potentially coming and also what may or may not manifest itself. But I think before we get started, probably worth explaining what the hype cycle is, don't you think, Andy?
Yeah, so the HypeCycle is the tool that we'll be using today to talk about up and coming health technologies, essentially. So let's just bring something onto the screen to help us explain. Oh, no, we want the two of us on the screen with it. Perfect. So the HypeCycle, it's a concept that's popularized by Gartner. They're a consultancy company in the US. Always just give them a mention, and I think we'll link to their video about it in the show notes below. But basically, it describes the evolution of a technology from it coming onto the scenes of new technology to being sort of a widespread mainstream, fully accepted technology in its field or more generally. Um, and uh, and it helps sort of just understand what happens through the lens of hype. So it's initially a technology is new, so we have an innovation trigger, and then often a lot of people are talking about the technology. A lot of people are writing about the technology and discussing its potential. And sometimes that can get a little bit ahead of the reality. So we often reach the peak of inflated expectations. So this is when everybody's talking about a technology. It might not yet be delivering, but it's really, really hot. After that, for many technologies, there is a trough of disillusionment where it doesn't live up to expectations and people stop discussing it so much. So you don't hear as much about it. And then some technologies die in the trough of disillusionment, and some emerge onto the slope of enlightenment as actually they begin to deliver on some of that initial promise, or perhaps deliver in different ways. People begin to adopt it, and then eventually they reach the plateau of productivity, where they are adopted by mainstream industry, business, governments, and used, and they're delivering on their potential. So it's a really it's become quite popular. This is a chart from another medical technologist. So this is the medical futurist who's very active on YouTube, and he's produced his hype cycle for this is for 2022, so the previous year, and he's more of a generalist, sort of looking at the whole spectrum of health technologies and health specialities. We're more experts, so we produce this, but very specialist for general practice. So hopefully people understand what the hype cycle is. Oh, the final thing, Andy, to say is why are we bothered and why is this useful? Useful in a few ways, but a lot of it is about timing your involvement with the technology or your organization involved with the technology. So, if, for example, you are a venture capitalist firm and you want to make bets on 100 different technologies in the hope that one of them will come through and 1000x your initial investment, then maybe you're focusing kind of on these emerging technologies. If you're an NHS trust, for example, then you might want to be picking things up as they come out of the trough of disillusionment or on the plateau of productivity. And if you're a GP practice, some might argue that maybe you want to exist around this plateau of productivity and not be too involved with experimental technologies, given your low risk tolerance for investing in something and it failing. So that's the hype cycle.
Okay. So we've done this before, haven't we, Andy? So we've had a look at previous things. It may be worth just quickly refreshing our eGPlearning and what we've covered in the past. So yeah, first one was back in 2020, wasn't it?
It was. I think we might have done it before, but I think that was before structured record keeping with an eGPlearning, and that would have been lost to the mists of time. But
if I remember right, this was the last episode we filmed before COVID actually happened together. So really interesting.
Yeah, it was on a whiteboard.
I think we filmed this in your office right before COVID happened, and we ended up going remote. So actually, we massively had to adapt things following the release of this hype cycle.
Yeah, I think that was 29. Yeah. Anyway, so it's really interesting to see how things have evolved over time there. I mean, just briefly spending some time from 2020, we thought maximum hype around video consultations, early in COVID. Primary care networks were something new that we thought were perhaps a little bit overhyped at that point in time. And interesting to see artificial intelligence just entering the trough of disillusionment there to
Mhm.
join blockchain and e-consultations and interoperability, which we felt hadn't progressed much in the previous few years. You have any reflections on this one from 2020, Gandhi?
No, I think, like you say, it was very much we were in. This was in the 1 year following, obviously, the start of PCN. So I think that's why we were trying to get over. We were getting over the hype of the initial kind of flux and enthusiasm and stuff, and settling into what potentially might PCNs in particular look like. Like you say, the artificial intelligence. Just to explain that part, because I know that's going to be relevant coming up in this episode. This was at the time where things like AI by certain companies like Babylon, that kind of stuff, were kind of less prevalent than they had been. And people weren't just talking about it as much as they were. So I think that's why we were heading towards that. Well, it's kind of past its fad and that kind of stuff and things. So yeah, it was an interesting time.
It was, yeah. I remember there were articles in the press just sort of the year before where Babylon's CEO was saying how there's going to be a doctor in your pocket, it's going to replace general practice, sort of saying things like that, and it wasn't quite living up to those expectations. And then HypeCycle 2021, it's a little bit misty on the screen because I had to take a screen capture from our previous video. I couldn't find the file. But this was the evolution into 2021. So we can see things moving along. Primary care networks. I think we were sort of entering the trough of disillusionment at that point in time. I think things have probably evolved since then, and certainly video consultations had more sort of come into their own and were beginning to be adopted more mainstream, and some new entrants like remote monitoring. As I think we've been distributing sort of SATS probes to people, and people were telling us the readings over the telephone. Sounds terribly untechnological, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But still, that was something new at that point in time. So that was an interesting time, and there were lots of things I think that we felt were becoming mainstream through use in the pandemic, like your video meetings and text messages, telephones, those brand new technologies.
Yeah,
But they were really delivering during the pandemic and have continued to.
absolutely. Being productive.
And then that's just firmed that up again. So, but shall we move into our hype cycle for 2023, hot technology in primary care? Drum roll if we had one, and bang, there it is.
Yeah.
Purple now, looks more trendy.
Yeah. Going for the dark mode.
Yeah, night mode now. So so we've changed the mode. Hopefully it looks a little bit better, a little bit more understandable for people. And so shall we use this as a tool, Gandhi, to talk through left to right and just kind of highlight what we're excited about, or if things have moved around? So anything grabbing your attention?
So I'm just going to make it bigger for the eGPlearning so they can see it. And obviously we're going to come slightly off screen as a result. But yeah, definitely in terms of the innovation trigger and stuff, there's some of the stuff we see is things that haven't really been part of the previous ones. And a couple of these we've also seen are definitely on the medical futurists version of HypeCycle, but interestingly at different places as well. And don't forget, we're looking at this from the perspective of primary care and general practice. So things like microbiome testing. I mean, yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it, Andy? Because it's not something that we particularly do in general practice, but it is something that has picked up some traction. And one of the things I actually remember, and apologies if I butcher this, but Dr. Rangesh something or other, the food doctor guy, he uses this a lot in his episodes and his TVs and his podcasts and stuff to try and help understand particular things that impact individual patients' health. And that's where it can be really quite effective in terms of understanding it. But it's definitely not something that's available to us out in general practice and in primary care and stuff, is it?
Yeah, no, I'm not having conversations with people about the microbes in their poo just yet, which is essentially what that is about, or the microbes that live, in and on us and around us, but the poo being the main place that people are looking at the moment. Although I think there's a lot of potential for that. I think in the future, I think people love personalized information, so I think personalized healthcare is going to be big, but I think that particular part of it is quite early, but just a new entrant onto our hype cycle there.
And just make it a bit bigger. I know this is one that you wanted to talk about. So virtual reality, and we've split it this time, haven't we, Andy?
Yeah, so we split it. So a number of these we've split out for the first time in this version of the hype cycle. VR was just there as one thing before, but we've split it into patient education and medical education. And actually, I think that I remember in 2018, do you remember going to the Doctorpreneur conference, Gandhi, in 2018? And even back then, I mean, it's what, 5 years ago now, but people were talking about using VR in medical education, and it sounded really, really promising. I think it still does sound promising, but I guess promise, not really delivering yet. And they were talking about using it to create a bit more reality around those basic life support, intermediate life support scenarios that we do as part of our life support training, just to put people a little bit more deeply in those scenarios so that they can practice their decision making
Yeah,
when faced with a bit more of a realistic presentation. Because often you're sort of like, okay, this dummy that has no arms, no legs is on the floor. Let's pretend that this person has had an electric shock. What are you going to do? But you can make that a lot more real. So, and that's just a very basic idea about how that might be used in medical education. But I think that that's quite promising. And people also talk about using it in patient education or patient therapeutics as well, which I think
yeah,
is different. But I think it's really relevant to separate some of these things out now. I guess if we were doing this in 1990, digital health might have just been one thing, and now it's a huge industry of all sorts of different things. So
absolutely.
I think these things don't only move along the cycle; they also kind
Yeah.
of.
You're right about the patient education aspect of it. So I've seen some projects which look particularly using VR as a method of doing pulmonary rehabilitation, because obviously that's a cohort of patients that are significantly potentially limited by their mobility to go to a central place to have education. Whereas if you can provide that through a virtual reality interface in collaboration with other members of that cohort, actually it's a really powerful thing that enables potentially benefit of their health and stuff. So yeah, I think it has
Yeah.
potential.
Yeah, so I thought that was interesting and noteworthy. The other thing which has made an entrance for the first time is this information as a determinant of health. So this was the strapline for the YouTube health
Yeah.
conference that we went to a few weeks ago, and I'm sure we'll link to the video in the show notes of our reflections on that. But we've talked about video before as a technology, but largely in terms of video consultations and things like that. But actually, pre-recorded video as a supportive tool for patient understanding of health or for health training of health professionals is a powerful tool. So I think it's important to break that out. And also, I've put in inverted commas informationome. So I may be the first person to talk about this. So Dr. Andrew Foster, the innovator of the concept of informationome. I googled it a while ago. There was nothing out there. So just like the microbiome has an influence on your health, I think the information that we receive, consume, and that lives in our heads has an impact on our health. So I'd like people to start talking about informationome, because you heard it here first on eGPlearning.
Yeah, we're going to timestamp that, code it with the YouTube video. There you go, everybody. Dr. Andy Foster's Informationome. Hope I pronounced that right, Andy.
Yeah, another just a general observation about the landscape this year with the HypeCycle is, I think in previous ones, probably because of COVID, we were focused on a lot of technologies that support access. So a lot of it was electronic consultation, a lot of it was about video consultation, telephone consultation, text messages, asynchronous consultation, all sorts of technologies like that. And it's really nice to be thinking a bit more widely and a bit more about things that might have more of an impact, not just on access, but on outcomes, on patient experience and understanding, and therapeutics. So just marking that really, and
I mean, an interesting one that I noticed on the HypeCycle is actually the 3D printing. So I know we didn't mention we're going to talk about this, but actually when we reflect, we saw the previous ones, actually 3D printing was actually towards the far end of productivity. And the reason we put it there at that time was during the COVID pandemic. Actually, in general practice, a lot of 3D printing was happening in terms of creating visors and that kind of stuff. It's kind of flung back a bit because actually the use case for that has now changed. And actually 3D printing is more being looked at in terms of assistive tools to help patients particularly. And that's potentially where we're going to see a different kind of explosion of use, I think, moving forward in terms of adaptations for equipment, homegrown kind of solutions in terms of how to make your life more manageable, particularly given the challenges we've got with certain aspects like supply and that kind of stuff, and potentially even 3D printing and medications, which I think is going to be the next potential part that we're seeing in terms of, creating combined medications, or even, we're hearing more and more about 3D printing organs and that kind of stuff. And that's definitely the forefront of how things are working, particularly from a primary care lens. Important to remember that part for those more super specialist people start saying, oh, we've been 3D printing organs for ages and stuff. So yeah,
I mean, that's something that might break out into different sections, I think, in the future. But there's all sorts of exciting things with 3D printed. I'm really excited about the one pill. How good would that be for compliance? A 3D printed pill that has all of the components that you would need to
Yeah.
ingest in a day for a patient. That would be so good, and so much safer as well than
Mhm.
lots of pots um, around. So moving up, so it's always interesting to try and call the top of something, isn't it?
Mhm.
What's at peak of inflated expectations, and we've had AI there before, and we've had primary care networks. And also data analysts there. So I keep meeting lots of data analysts. So there's a lot of hiring of data analysts, a lot of talk of data
Mhm.
analytics and population health management. And I'm a big believer in it. Actually, and some of my roles are involved in population health management and the use of data. But it just feels like there's a lot of talk about it, and I think we probably need or not need to, but I think we will be making this more of a routine part of our work, and
Mhm.
maybe having less hype around the use of big data sets and data analysts. And it'll be interesting to see how successful we are with some of these population health
Mhm.
managements that are driven by big data. So yeah, anything that you would call the top of Gandhi this year?
No, I think you're right. The data analyst was the key one. I guess if we're looking at other kind of things, not necessarily technology based, but I think the concept of things like social link workers in particular. I think we've reached the peak of what we're seeing in terms of how the uptake of it and stuff. The reason why I wouldn't put them in terms of the other parts, in terms of like the slope of enlightenment and productivity and stuff, because I think there's still potential for how that would change. And obviously we've got changes that may happen in terms of the P10 contracts itself that may massively change how they're used in general practice. But I think we're at that peak of like where what they can do, I think, in the current healthcare environment and stuff, but not to dismiss the fact they are all doing amazing work and stuff. So please don't take it in that sense for those that are something. I think I'm putting a lot of disclaimers with this episode of people trying to flame us, and I don't
Hey,
know.
it's the future, Gandhi. It's
It's
hard
the
to get it
future.
right.
That's what you predict,
It's
isn't it?
the future is difficult. It's difficult getting
Mm,
that crystal ball out. The other thing I would just add actually is, this is quite a pronounced hype cycle, here
mm,
on this curve that we're showing on the screen, but actually it can be a lot flatter for different technologies, and some of them,
yeah.
never enter much of a trough of disenlightenment at all. So, maybe
Mhm.
data analysts and social link work prescribers can follow that trajectory of adoption. Um, so just moving on. So consumer wearables. I've put that entering the trough of disillusionment, but actually, I'm perhaps more optimistic than that about consumer wearables. We've talked about it before. Increasingly, I'm having people come in showing me ECGs from their smartwatches, or getting notifications about irregular
Mm.
heartbeats, for example. And I'm finding that quite useful, actually,
Mhm.
to deal with, and I'm really, happy and keen to engage with that. I suppose there's just so much more potential in these devices
Yeah.
for me, and that's, I guess, why we put it there. But that could easily be a bit further forwards.
I think you're right. It's heading towards the slope of kind of stage of enlightenment, sorry, and things. And I think one of the challenges, though, is that because there's so much breadth of the type of devices that you can have and the reliability of what they have, I think that's why it's also a challenge within general practice to understand how to use the information from consumer wearables. Whereas, approved wearables is a lot more challenging because it requires things like MRIA authentication, certification, that kind of stuff. And a lot of devices don't have that level of certification and stuff. And that's why there's, I think, this element of, well, it's data. How effective is that data? And how can we make it more effective, I think, is the next question. And that's possibly where unified platforms and that kind of stuff may help to bring some of that through. But it's still, I think there's still a way to go before it becomes mainstream or that kind of stuff, particularly in the UK.
Yeah. I mean, it's particularly good at raising a flag, I think. So
Mm,
someone will come and say, I've had some irregular heart rate notifications on my
mm,
device. Shall we look into that? And we might never have raised that flag or realized that there could
true.
be a problem there before. So I think it's really useful at the moment for those sorts of things. But in terms of, looking at someone's heart rate variability over a period of time and predicting that they
Mm,
might be about to become unwell, we're not there yet. But that's the promise that, that is there for these wearable devices, including consumer wearables. I guess this is one of a few things which are sort of paired, really. So consumer wearables, we can sort of pair with remote monitoring in a way. And I think by remote monitoring, we mean medical grade equipment that
yeah.
people will wear or have in their home that monitors things like, so we talk about oxygen saturations. A really good example of this is the Libra devices that
Mm,
diabetics can wear now, or anyone can wear them, but popular with type 1 diabetics in the UK, to give sort of real-time blood glucose monitoring or flash monitoring, where they can flash their phone and download the data. And that's that's really exciting. I know that's helping our teams that help care for people
Yeah.
with diabetes really get their control really good, to avoid long-term complications of diabetes, but also avoid short-term complications of overtreatment with insulin and hypoglycemic episodes. So, and alerting people when that's happening. And that's just a small section of it, isn't it? People talk about all sorts of remote monitoring potentially in the future, in terms of SATs, blood pressure, ECGs. I mean, we do an element of that, don't we, with people who have implantable cardiac devices that
Yep.
download data to a bedside device that goes to their cardiologist. So some people are already experiencing that, but that's just a taster of what might be to come. So we put that as something entering the slope of enlightenment. I think a long way to go with that, and a lot of potential still to be realized.
And I think there's also an element of uptake within the population. So I think you'll have particular cohorts of patients which will be really on the ball. Obviously devices has a huge impact in that. So something like the Apple Watch, for example, will give you potentially almost near medical or medical grade level information and variety of sensors in one device. Whereas, patients in a deprived area won't even have access to a lot of this kind of stuff, or more importantly, won't know how to access a lot of this kind of stuff, because they may have some of that, for example, on their mobile phone, that kind of stuff, but it's not hit the mainstream in terms of use within healthcare yet. That's the key.
Absolutely. Gandhi, just thinking of future episodes, I mean, that kind of digital divide would be a really good episode to do, because there's something about affordability and access to the technology, and then there's actually knowing what it can do, knowing how to do it, knowing how to use it, which is different. Because I see a lot of patients in my area with Apple Watches, or with certainly with smartphones, but it's about being able to use it for those health applications, and there's often an education need there. So that was an interesting sort of pair to contrast consumer and medical grade wearables. I mean, the next one that we have along is one of the AI technologies or AI concepts. And in previous versions of this, AI has just been one thing, which now feels a little bit odd.
So tell us about this, Andy, because we split it into almost 4 different sections this time around, haven't we? So talk us through that.
Yeah, and we could have split it into even more, really. So there's lots of different AI technologies. There's lots of different applications for AI technologies, and lots of different kind of points in healthcare journey that they can act. So we were beginning to think about, they're not necessarily in order of the patient journey here, but back when people were talking about Babylon being, the doctor in your pocket, people were really alluding to AI decision making. That the AI would get information about your symptoms and about your health, and it would tell you what to do, or what you could do to help with your health. That was, if not the overt promise, that was the implicit kind of promise, I think. And that's really, really complicated, and comes with all sorts of risks and responsibilities, and discussions about where those responsibilities lie. And actually, even, the underlying capabilities required to do that are really, really complicated. So we split it out into AI decision making. There's a lot of AI diagnostics. Again, that's really a little bit too broad, but I think we were talking about support with diagnostics. So interpretation of imaging, interpretation of blood tests. And some people might put that, further up the slope of enlightenment, but it's here on the HypeCycle as a separate entity at the moment. I think AI decision support is something I'm quite interested or excited about, and that's actually presenting the clinician with information to support them as they make a diagnosis, information about guidelines, how one might interpret, additional information that might be required to make a better diagnosis. So that's interesting. And then finally, and Gandhi, I'm hoping you'll talk in a bit more detail about this, because you had a fantastic episode with Dr. Keith Grimes about ChatGPT. I think we broadly called this concept AI supporting understanding. So managing information to help with either patients understand things or clinicians understand things more deeply. So that's how we've broken them out here. And there are slightly different points on the HypeCycle now. Any that you want to talk to, Gandhi? I'm particularly interested to hear a little bit more about ChatGPT.
Yeah, so I think, like you say, there's definitely different lenses to look at this from. I mean, in terms of decision making, that whole concept of how patients interact with AI, and we've still not seen that fly as I think many people predicted it would be when we talked earlier about, like particular platforms using it as a method to help patients understand how to navigate the system. Because the problem is patients want what they want, and that they will often try and break the system to make it what they can achieve and stuff. So we continue to see that. I think the diagnostics, in terms of, we're seeing a lot more of that and heading into it. Obviously, radiology, there's lots of AI algorithms already being used to support diagnostic criteria and figuring out reports and that kind of stuff. And I think we're going to see more of that as it integrates within the EPR system to help clinicians pick up patients of concern, and also in terms of data analytics and stuff. So enhancing those kind of aspects. Decision support, I'm just going to talk about briefly, is a really interesting one, and it feeds into some of the other stuff that we've got. So I think somewhere on here we've got smart triage or those kind of things within the e-consultations. And actually, a lot of the providers are now looking at how can you use AI to make the e-consultation aspect of the workload in general practice more manageable. And can you use AI to pick out particular phrases, words, terms, those kind of things that potentially should be dealt with more urgently compared to other kind of concerns and stuff, and how reliable is that? There's also questions obviously in terms of whose responsibility is it if that doesn't work. There's always an issue when it comes to AI within medical healthcare. And that absolutely feeds into the fourth one, which is the one you wanted me to talk about, which was ChatGPT. So for those that don't know, ChatGPT is the first and probably the biggest of these new large language model type of platforms that basically analyze information and can process that in a way that actually tries to answer the question more so than just searching for an answer. It presents you with reasoning in some way of that particular aspect. And I think one of the key things, a lot of those type of platforms come with massive disclaimers that these shouldn't really be used with healthcare and that kind of stuff, because that's not what they're designed with yet. That's the key thing. They're massively exponential in their growth and use and stuff. But in terms of processing information, so one of the really good use cases I saw, this was in the episode with Keith Grimes, which we will definitely link to the end of this one if you want to have a look at, is putting in a complex MRI report and asking ChatGPT to simplify that. And it will take a really complex MRI report, for example, of a knee and that kind of stuff, and put it into simple context words that you can then send to the patient and say, we talked about your MRI scan. This is what it shows. Here's the information in detail for you to manage and understand after the appointment or in preparation of the appointment, however you want to use it and stuff. And there are various other use cases that we talk about in that particular episode as well that has benefit. But again, one of the key problems is at the moment, those commercially available AI platforms are not available to you or shouldn't really be used in medical healthcare yet. And I keep saying yet. I think that's going to be potentially the journey. And that's why, like you said, we put that one a little bit further down the slope of enlightenment, because I think it is heading towards that point where it's going to become mainstream.
Yeah. So it's the slow adopt I think about parallels with language translation technologies here. And I know for many years I've just been hoping that Google Translate can get their technology to that level where organizations like the NHS are happy to say that we can use it to translate medical information, even not within consultations, but even information delivered in leaflets and videos and so forth. And it's not quite there yet, and it feels like it's taken so long. So I always just take some of these promises about things like ChatGPT or language translation with a pinch of salt, because I'm just aware of how long it takes for these things to get good enough for risk-averse organizations, rightly risk-averse, because this is people's lives and it's healthcare, to be happy to sign off on them and say that they can be used. So lots of promise, and I hope it doesn't take as long as language translation to really come to fruition. So I'm just picking another one off Gandhi, just moving on from AI. I'm going to go to dashboards and real-time data because we could almost be actually at the peak of inflated expectations for this sort of technology as well. We're just seeing a lot of these come through, having internally within general practice had a lot of data coming through for a long time. We have eHealthscope as a platform in Nottinghamshire and other areas will have their own that seeks to do useful things with quite recent, if not real-time, data from general practice and health records and do things like help us identify patients that might be at risk of an admission within the next few months,
Mm.
and things like that. And also feedback on our own performance, and allow us to benchmark our performance as a practice next to the performance of other practices in all sorts of different ways. And I think those have just been getting slowly better over time.
Yeah.
The data they use has probably been getting better, but data quality is a huge issue for metrics and dashboards. But I think we'll be seeing more of those coming
Yep.
forwards. I'm almost wishing I'd put it at the peak of inflated expectations now, Gandhi, actually, rather than data analysts as I begin to talk about it. And yeah, what do you think about dashboards and real-time information?
I think the problem is we're on dashboard overload, aren't we? Everything's got a dashboard nowadays, and it's that question of how much access do you use to the data that's provided. A really good example would be the GPAD data. We now have dashboards of showing us general practice access data and appointment data and stuff, and that's being conflated to understand workload in general practice, when actually we know for the fact that the data shown doesn't represent everything that's captured. So therefore, as a result of that, it's not a fair representation. Therefore, it's not a great data set to use to align to what people are thinking it does, when actually it shows a different kind of piece of information. And that's one of the failures of using dashboard and real-time data and stuff, is if it doesn't show the data you're actually wanting to know, or you conflate it with something else, what's the flipping point in the first place then? So whereas I think there are aspects where dashboards can be really useful. Obviously, we know that in terms of monitoring of things like QoF, IAF, searching for patients that need particular health outcomes, looking at in terms of reviews and that kind of stuff, it can be really powerful to help you plan and predict what kind of workload you need to do. I think there's definitely parts of these that need to become smarter and more intelligent to use, and absolutely to the companies who create them, please focus on UI and UX. That's the biggest thing, because actually if it's a dashboard that shows information, but people, the average person cannot interpret that data, it's pointless.
Yeah. I suppose how many dashboards do you have to look at before you get to the point where you're going to crash the car? Because of information overload. You're not looking at the road or the patients in front of you.
Exactly.
Special mention just from me for continuity metrics. Continuity is going to become a bigger issue as we go into the next year. It was in the Fuller Stock Take, it was in the Health Select Committee report. And I think when we have the upcoming document about GP access coming out in the next few weeks, I would be surprised if continuity metrics, maybe even a continuity dashboard, don't make it into there.
Yet another dashboard. Yeah.
Andy, you were quite interested in talking about co-production technologies and them appearing in the HypeCycle this year. What were your thinkings there?
So, I mean, you can twin this with some of the other ones that are also in the same areas, assistive technologies, and also to a degree, patient access as well. And I think this is the key concept of the fact that, increasingly we're trying to bring patients along their journey of health with us. And there are definitely certain parts of that need to continue to be developed. But actually, I think there's the understanding that these are essential parts of healthcare moving forward. So, in terms of actually when you're creating work or content or services and stuff, to have patients on board with you in terms of what that looks like and stuff. So how do you foster those opinions? And we've seen this with, increasingly we're looking more at asking patients about their opinions on services and healthcare delivery and all that kind of stuff and things. In terms of assistive technologies, sharing that information back out, making it readable, making it understandable, making it translatable, all those kind of things are tools that we are commonly now using. The practice websites should be available in a format that allows them to be easily read and easily understood for broader aspects of the populations and stuff. And then, the big one is obviously access to health records. And this is a really interesting one because it's fluctuated. I think there's a general understanding that access to the health records can be really powerful and useful to the majority of the population. Obviously, there's been a lot of churn and problems over the past year in terms of switching on online access to records for patients, particularly from general practice perspective, because of the push for it to be all patients rather than patients who choose to have it, because there is a massive difference there. But I think overall, it's a journey of all three of those things that actually we are seeing becoming more and more mainstream, but also in terms of benefit to overall healthcare. It is definitely the trajectory that we're looking at and stuff.
Yeah, really good points. I would just come back to co-production Co-Production, actually, I just want to highlight and just sort of thank, it's probably NHS Digital or NHS Digital. May she rest in peace.
Well,
But
yeah, it's now NHS England, isn't it? They've all been
yeah, it's been
incorporated
wrapped
into
up
one
into NHS
official
England.
organisation as of 3 days ago, the time of us filming this. So,
but co-production technologies, I'm just thinking about some co-production experiences I've had in the recent past that I wasn't having 2 or 3 years ago, and it's mainly around actually MS Teams and
mm,
the NHS's version of Microsoft 365 that they've subscribed to, which I hope they continue to subscribe to going forwards.
mm,
Because I was in a recent meeting, and there were community representatives who were joining us, on Teams, using their mobile phones. It was accessible enough for them to join us. That's patient representation, other healthcare professionals, and we were doing things like using MS Forms, which is now
mm,
free to use within the NHS to send surveys out to patients, paper copies available as well, to get the patient's views on physical activity within the area, and opportunities to be physically active. And that sort of thing wouldn't really have been possible, or to do as quickly and collaborate as quickly and
yeah,
move as quickly, without those technologies. And they're not 3D printing, they're not virtual reality, but they are a technology, and they are really, really helping. So I think noteworthy mention for Microsoft 365 as a co-production technology.
mhm,
Something on here for the first time, Gandhi, we have a negative technology on here,
mhm,
which is misinformation, and it's jumped straight into plateau of productivity or misproductivity
mm,
there. I was think just to highlight that we might always assume that technologies represent progress and that technologies represent improvement, but technologies can be a double-edged sword, and they
yeah,
can have harm, do harm as well as do good. And there might be other technologies on here that might be doing harm in terms of damaging, the patient relationship, or damaging continuity and so forth. So it's just highlighting that technology not always good, and we need to be aware of
no.
the downsides. But yeah, misinformation, huge problem. Anything more you wanted to say around that one,
No,
Gandhi?
like you said, sharing the correct and the appropriate information is an increasing challenge, because it's also about the challenge you've got to explain that information to patients, where they're listening to, what they're listening to, who they're listening to. All those kind of things play into a part, and we're seeing massive elements of this with various parts of our lives, whether it's just healthcare or whether it's politics, media, every kind of stuff and things. But it's really interesting that the sway that certain things can have on populations, on people, and that kind of stuff. And actually, correct information often is the best way to empower people to make the right decisions about what they would choose to do. And overcoming that is becoming a bigger burden in some ways. And it's a challenge that we need to recognize it is going to be then a growing challenge that we need to recognize is going to be there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. People were talking about pre-bunking at YouTube Health, which I thought was
Mm,
really interesting. Finding out what health misconceptions people have, or that might potentially infect people, and then immunize against them
mm,
by pre-bunking with better quality information to occupy that space
yep.
first. So I think actually talking about it alongside other technologies
Mhm,
helps think about solutions, I guess. There are some technologies which we are retiring from the hype cycle this year. So in 2023, these technologies will be retired from the hype cycle. We won't talk about them again unless they become relevant. These are things which actually I think they were particularly noteworthy during the pandemic as being technologies which they're technological. They weren't new, but they became suddenly really, really relevant,
mm,
and helpful, and perhaps weren't being used to their full before. It
yeah.
seemed, in terms of particularly text messages, they were really, really useful during the pandemic, particularly
Mm,
together with hyperlinks to other information. It
mm,
was quite a universal way of getting information into people's hands. And telephone consultations similarly really came into their own during the pandemic, alongside electronic prescription services.
mhm,
No need to physically come in and pick up a green bit of paper. That was really, really important. An email was used increasingly. So thank you for your service, and you will not be forgotten, but you're retired from the hype cycle.
mhm.
Yeah. So Gandhi, I guess before we wrap up, any one or two technologies that you're really, really excited about for the next, 1, 2, 3 years coming up, or perhaps it's an emergent one that that we may not see the fruits of for 10 years, but anything that you're particularly excited about?
So the one that's on there that we haven't talked about that I'm keen and curious to know how it's going to develop is things like blockchain and other stuff like NFT and that kind of stuff. So it's way down at the trough of disillusionment. And I think that's because in terms of using it within particularly primary care at the moment, that there's this question of how can we make it, usable, functional, and that kind of, and decentralized. And I think the problem with that is that, a lot of the stuff within healthcare isn't decentralized. It is held within the whole concept of the security blankets of NHS organizations, the data, all that kind of stuff. But actually, is that somewhere we need to move towards to really free up how we deliver healthcare and stuff? So in some ways you could put this almost at most of the earlier parts of the hype cycle, I think. But I think at the moment no one's talking about it in UK healthcare, at the very least, in significant amounts. So I think it is in the trough of disillusionment. But the question is it one that's just going to bounce out at some point? And all I think it takes is one thing. We saw that with text messages, didn't we? Text messages suddenly just came out of nowhere and opened up the healthcare system in such a weird way. I think blockchain might do the same, to be honest, at some point. But it's just the use case.
Yeah, at the moment, people say it's a solution looking for a problem, don't they? It's really, really interesting technology, and we did a video on it a while ago, which we'll link to as well, about blockchain and NFTs in health. But it's just struggling to find real world applications at the moment. I wonder if this is one where, a bit like the AI, where it might actually get broken out into a few different, discrete technologies or concepts that actually become useful, and that actually all of this talk around blockchain was just way too early, and maybe it deserves to be closer to the innovation trigger. It's still a very new technology. But yeah, that's an interesting one, and definitely worth a mention. For me, the thing that I'm probably most excited about in my day-to-day practice, I'm going to pick two actually. Co-production technologies, because I've been really enjoying co-producing things with the community and our primary care network, and other colleagues. And I think that we will continue to use those. So that's my pick for moving into the plateau of productivity and being really, really useful. And then in terms of things that I'm really excited about, I'd like to learn a lot more and experiment a bit with ChatGPT and these AI technologies. I think it's really early days for them. I'd like to have a play, really. So I'm quite excited about those two.
Cool. So that is our 2023 Hype Cycle by eGPlearning, looking at primary care healthcare technology and the impact it may have and stuff. Obviously, we talked about various other content that we think you should really have a look at. So if you do want to do so, have a look at this one right here that talks about ChatGPT. And you mentioned the other one that talks about blockchain and NFTs and stuff that are coming up right here for you to have a look at. And as always, we're here to help tech enhance your primary care and learning. Catch us next time as we continue to the journey along general practice, healthcare, and technology. Catch you then.